Hello, my name is Jerry Volesky. I'm the Range and Forage Specialist at the West Central Research and Extension Center here in North Platte. Today, for my presentation, we're going to talk just a bit about some important grazing management principles. First, I'd like to just give a bit of an update where we are with respect to the drought monitor and the conditions across the high plains. Focusing in, of course, here in Nebraska, we can see that the northeast corner of the state, as well as the west, southwest, and some parts of the south central are in the either abnormally dry or moderate drought conditions. And of course, when it comes to our pasture conditions, the precipitation we're receiving during the growing season, of course, is very important. Another type of figure I like to look at comes from the High Plains Regional Climate Center. And this particular map is showing the percent of normal precipitation since April 1st of this year and through the period of July 21st. So roughly the last 3.5 months. But it does somewhat mimic or reflect what the drought monitor is showing, where again here in northeast Nebraska, we are below normal in precipitation for that time period. And similarly for western and southwest and parts of south central Nebraska, also it's been quite dry. And then also you notice this area here in north central or the northeastern sandhills of Nebraska has been above average precipitation. And that's been the case for this area for the last going on 2 to 3 years now. That high water and a lot of the meadows and hay fields, limiting the amount of hay that can be cut. Or sites at the Barter Brothers Ranch, we've got a number of small pastures, and this particular area here where there is the water, 3 years ago that would have been normally dry, and you can even see our stock tank has become a boat. So too much rain in some places and not enough in others. Now, getting back to this topic today, I was talking about these important grazing management principles. There are three things I'll briefly cover today in this presentation. First being stocking rate. The second is going to be the timing of grazing in our pastures. And then the distribution of our grazing. And that has to do with any rotations we might do, as well as stocking density. Okay, now with that term stocking rate, and I've got also up here stocking density, because those two terms sometimes are mixed up or confused, but just a brief definition of each. So when we are talking about stocking rate, we're talking about the numbers of animals or animal units over a described time period per area of land. So things like animal unit days per acre, AUMs per acre, or even transposing that into acres per animal unit for 6 months are all different ways of describing stocking rate. It does have to have that time component out there. Sometimes you'll hear people talking about how they're stocked at 8 acres, say, per cow-calf pair, but you really have to give that length of time they're out there to truly define what that stocking rate is. And the other term associated with this is stocking density. And that is simply the number of animals or animal units per area of land at any given time. And oftentimes you'll see that described as animal units per acre, head per acre, or even sometimes the pounds of live weight per acre. Now, when it comes to determining where our stocking rate is, one of the things we do have to know is at least have an estimate of what the productivities of our pastures is. And when we look at a sketch here of a grass plant, one of the approaches that we like to use to describe how that forage is used is that we have 25% here, which is the livestock consumption. So that's what the animals actually used. And then that is the same as what we describe as harvest efficiency. Another 25% we assign or typically goes to what we lose from trampling, wildlife, grasshoppers, those types of things. And then the remaining 50% we like to leave and call that left for plant vigor. So basically that just gets back to the old concept of adage of take half and leave half for the plant vigor. It is rainfall, of course, that is the main driver of what our pastures are going to produce. And this figure here just shows the 23 years going back to 1997 annual precipitation at the Barter Brothers Ranch through last year. And you can see that in 2019, we had a very wet year. Similarly, 2018 was quite wet as well. This slide here is getting a little bit more specific, and it shows the May, June, and July total precipitation for 1999 through 2017. So we're just looking at those 3 months. And when you have a mixed cool and warm season grass like in the sandhills or northeast Nebraska, if you've got a mixture of some native range with big blue stem, switchgrass, as well as smooth brome and things like Kentucky blue, again, that mix of cool and warm season, those 3 months of May, June, and July are the most important. And if we the precipitation for that 3-month period on the left, and then the production that we saw, again, going back to 1999, we see it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good relationship from year to year in terms of that amount of rainfall in those 3 months and what the pasture production was that particular year. Now, in other parts of the country, this is from eastern Wyoming, where they're dealing with mostly a cool season type of pasture land. The months of April and May have a very strong relationship with the pasture production that they'll see in a given year. Now, the production that we do see on average in our pasture is really what the driving force or factor is in setting our stocking rates. So just a quick example here, where at the Barter Brothers Ranch, northeastern Sandhills, we produce on average about 1,804 pounds per acre production. And if we take that times an estimated harvest efficiency, and again, that is the amount consumed, we get our 542 pounds consumed, and that would be per month. And then 542 divided by 780, and that 780 is the average consumption in a month by an animal unit. We come up then with a 0.70 AUM per acre as far as the recommended average stocking rate. But of course, one of the things you see each year can be quite a bit of variability in the pasture production. Here, back in 2015, good year, we had over 2,600 pounds produced. A drought year in 2002, only 880 pounds were produced. So that's about a threefold difference in our pasture production in a given year. And so it is, of course, very important to balance our demand. That would be our number of cattle out there with a supply of forage that we have in any given year. Now, the second important concept I want to talk just a little bit about is the timing of grazing, or our seasonal distribution of grazing. In this example here, we've got 4 pastures, W1, 2, 3, 4, which are managed as a set, or they're part of a rotation together. Similarly, for these 3 called E1, 2, 3, and 4, then there's also here a set of 8 pastures that are managed as a set in a rotation. So in the 4 pasture set here with the W, you can see the shaded area indicates the time of year those pastures were grazed. So here, W3 is when we started in mid to late May. We were in there about a month, a little short of a month. Then they went to W4. Then after that, in late July, they were grazing in W2 through August, and then finished out the season in W4 in September up to mid-October. Similarly, in this set of 8 pastures, we went through each of the pastures twice. We began in N3. We were there for just about a week, so this is kind of a quicker flash graze. Went through the pastures here up to middle of July is when we began the second rotation through the pastures. Now, timing of grazing is very important with respect to how our grazing affects our grasses. Now, this chart here is from the sandhills grasses, but we could consider our other species, such as the warm season species, such as big blue stem, um, uh, switchgrass, Indian grass. They would be very similar to these warm season sandhills grasses here. Cool season grasses in the sandhills, it's primarily needle and thread, but smooth brome grass would be a counterpart, introduced cool season species that is, of course, very common in a lot of our pastures. It has a rapid growth phase during the month of May, and then there's some differences between warm season grasses, but in general, if we look at that latter part of June into early August, those warm season grasses are making rapid growth, and that would be the phase where they begin elongation and are about to produce a seed head. Now, from research done previously, we've seen that, and this is using prairie sandreed as an example, but it looked at the effect of time of grazing at energy reserves or carbohydrate reserves of the prairie sandreed plants. And so what they did, they had treatments of either a mid-month 5-day grazing period in June, July, August, or after the killing frost that occurred in October. And so what it's showing here is that compared to October, or the dormant season, a June or July grazing did have the greatest, or produced the greatest reduction of energy reserves in the prairie sandreed. In August, it was somewhere in between at 83%. In another example here, this is looking at sand blue stem, of course, be kind of big blue stem's counterpart, but it's looking at the root response to grazing. And it has both root weight per plant, and then TNC stands for total non-structural carbohydrates in the plant. And here in this particular trial, they had grazing periods of in October. Again, that would be like the control when it is dormant after killing frost. And then either June, July, August, a combination of June and August, and then every month, June, July, and August during the summer. And what they saw was that compared again to October, particularly the lowest or the greatest negative effect on root weight was when they grazed every month in June, July, and August, 5.4 versus 8 grams per plant. And similar response for the carbohydrates of the October or dormant season grazing versus what happened when grazed all 3 of those primary summer months. So in general, we can look at that impact of grazing, the timing of grazing, and this would be for warm season grasses. So it's just a relative scale here, low to high. Now, if it were dormant season, say October to March, grazing those warm season grasses, very little, if any, impact on the vigor of those. But the primary time period then would be latter part of June as well as July and beginning into the early part of August. For cool grasses, it kind of goes a little bit the opposite, where we know that a cool season grass primarily has most of its rapid growth during the month of May, and so grazing at that time for a cool season grass would have the greatest negative impact. In some cases too, when there's adequate rainfall in the fall, we'll have growth of cool season grasses taking place in September and October, and then grazing can also have a bit of an impact on them at that time as those cool season grasses are getting ready to go into the winter. So one of the things that we highly recommend or suggest is some type of rotation. And this table here just gives an example of where we might have 5 different pastures, and then down the left column here are just dates that those pastures could be grazed. So say let's use 2020 as our starting year. For example, in pasture 1, we may have began grazing in mid-May. We were there for about 20 days or so, but then we rotated to pasture 2 for 1 month, June 5 to July 5. Then we went on to pasture 3, pasture 4, and ended up the season on November 1st grazing pasture 5. And so that would be the sequence for 2020. But the important thing is that next year in our plans, we want to avoid grazing the same pasture at the same time each year. So in 2021, we begin our grazing in pasture 2, then go to 3, 4, 5, and end up in pasture 1. And then each year, as you can see, going through 2022 through 2024, every pasture is grazed at a different time period in that 5-year overall time period. And what that does, it's very important, it does, again, like I said, it gives, particularly in this case here, if we look at in 2020, pastures 4 and 5, they've had a good part of the growing season already go by without those plants having been grazed. And so here in this case, this year, 4 and 5, they're the ones that are really going to benefit and build up a lot of vigor in those grass plants. The last one I want to talk just a little bit about is our grazing distribution and how that can factor in how our pastures, of course, are utilized. Get moving here. Of course, different factors that affect grazing distribution include how far do they have to travel for water, the topography that you're dealing with, where we might have our salt or mineral. The shade, of course, during the hot part of the summer can really force animals to congregate in certain parts of pastures. Then also within a pasture, we may have differences in the amount of forage and how that's distributed across the pasture. And then even at different times of the year, you'll see pastures can be grazed differently. Why grazing distribution is so important? Well, when we do have what we call poor grazing distribution, we know we're going to get a lower harvest efficiency, or in other words, the amount of forage that is consumed. That oftentimes leads then to lower production per acre. In time or over time, we will have repeated overgrazing in certain parts of the pasture, and that will lead to decreased range condition in those localized and heavily grazed areas. Now, in improving grazing distribution, of course, there's some things we can do there as well. Increasing the number of watering points, again, depending on the size of the pasture that you're dealing with, of course. Placement of our salt, mineral, or supplements we might be using. Cross fencing, of course, is going to be oftentimes associated with increasing water points if we are doing some of that to kind of facilitate some type of rotational grazing. Prescribed burning, another approach there that could be used, where we do know that in certain types of pastures where prescribed burning is used, they use a technique called patch burn grazing, where the entire pasture isn't burned, but they may focus on part of that pasture 1 year and burn it. And then, of course, after the burn, that area is highly attractive to the cattle. This slide here has a couple of figures that illustrate low stocking density versus high stocking density. And on the left, with the low, of course, we have one pasture unit, and say in the example here, maybe has 5 head cattle in it. Then on the right, under a high stocking density scenario, we may have 21 in this case, very relatively small pastures, but also has 5 head in each of those small pastures at any given time. And then, of course, under the high stock density pasture, they would be rotated through all of those 21 smaller pastures. But as you would imagine, when it comes to the distribution of grazing across these two, on the left with low stocking density, those animals have quite a large area to select where they're going to graze and what they're going to graze. On the right side with the high stocking density, overall our distribution of grazing is going to be very good and across those entire 21 small pasture areas. Now, of course, to do these rotations, just a couple things here quickly on what we can define as grazing systems, which is simply just a specialization of grazing management, which defines the periods of grazing and non-grazing or rest. There's a lot of different names out there for grazing systems. For example, you may have heard of short duration, deferred rotation, season-long continuous. There's management intensive grazing, and so on. But whenever we do have multiple pastures, that does allow for us to get better control of the timing of grazing. And of course, earlier I was talking quite a bit about that importance of the time of grazing and adjusting that each year to really, that goes a long way to improve the vigor and overall production of our pastures. And this is just a general classification of some different types of grazing systems. Of course, very common would be a season-long continuous, where we might have just the one pasture. Cattle are turned out, say, in mid-May and remain in that same pasture all the way through October, or what would be called the grazing season. Another one here called a rest rotation. We don't see that too much, but maybe more so in some of the western states, where they may have 5 pastures that are managed together as a set. But each year, one pasture gets complete rest. It is not used during the growing season, but the other 4 pastures would be rotated through in a sequence, something like this. And then also another type, deferred rotation, is one that I really like, where again, in the example, we have 5 pastures managed together as a set. And then they begin in pasture 1, go to 2, 3, 4, and end the season in 5. And then the more management intensive or short duration has 10 pastures in the example here. And you see each pasture has a relatively short, quick grazing period in May and early June, or through June. And then they go through those pastures again a second time during the remainder of the growing season. Now, some of the key principles when we're planning pasture rotations, what we've seen over the years on arid to semi-arid grasslands, so that would be central Nebraska, and of course arid would be further west into the United States. There is generally no advantage to having more than one grazing period during the primary growing season. But that doesn't exclude where you might do a quick spring flash grazing or a period of grazing during the winter or dormant season. On our high rainfall grasslands, or could it could be an irrigated grass pivot or some sub-irrigated meadow. 2 or more grazing periods is often very effective and allows us to capitalize on the regrowth potential of the forage. In some work we did on sub-irrigated meadows that we were grazing, in one particular study, we found it to be very effective, where we were having 4 to even 5 grazing rotations through a set of those sub-irrigated meadow pastures. A little bit on length of grazing period and length of rest period. Again, as you can see in this diagram here, that just gives 4 general categories of grazing systems. When we have a season-long continuous type of approach, May through October, really the only rest period then, of course, for that pasture is November through the following May, or basically the dormant season. But if we look at one of these, say the deferred rotation here, where pasture 2, for example, in this case, grazed primarily the month of June, it has virtually, or it does have 11 months of a rest period, again, before it is grazed the following season. And some principles related to the length of a grazing period in our pasture rotations. Generally, when the vegetation is growing rapidly, such as in spring and early summer, our grazing periods in a pasture, as well as our rest periods, can be shorter. And then correspondingly, as The vegetation grows more slowly late in the summer. Our length of stay and our grazing periods become longer in a pasture. And so just to kind of wrap things up here, we always encourage our grazing managers to have clear range and pasture vegetation objectives. Keep in mind where your stocking rates are at, and when possible, adjusting those stocking rates because of the rainfall you have in any given summer. Um, when we do get into those drought conditions, we've seen too from research over the years that the combination of drought and heavy grazing can be very detrimental to our grasses and have long-term effects a couple of years down the road in what we see from our pasture production. If we are able to develop some type of pasture rotation, this could certainly help improve our harvest efficiency and potentially improve our grazing distribution. And then lastly, with the respect to the timing of grazing I talked about, avoid grazing the same pasture at the same time each year. So just keep that changing that sequence of grazing. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today, and feel free to contact me at jerry.volesky.unl.edu.